The cowboy gave his last water to an Apache woman. What happened next changed everything. Luke sat on his horse, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun hung high in the sky, an unblinking eye that burned down on the desert below. Sweat soaked his shirt, his hands tight on the reins. He had been riding for hours, and the water in his canteen was almost gone. The land around him stretched endlessly, dunes, dry earth, and nothing but the heat shimmering in the distance. It wasn't the first time he had been through the desert, but it was the hottest he had ever experienced. His horse, old and weary, was stumbling with every step. Luke knew they wouldn't make it much longer unless they found water. The nearest watering hole was days away, and he didn't know if he could make it that far. The landscape was merciless, and he couldn't afford to wait. As he pushed forward, his heart sank. In the distance, something moved. At first, he thought it was just the heat playing tricks on his eyes. But as he drew closer, he saw a figure stumbling along the edge of the desert, almost collapsing in the sand. It was a woman, tall and thin, with long black hair that whipped around her face like a dark storm cloud. Her skin was dark, and she wore clothes that looked worn and faded from the sun. Luke's heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be out here. The desert was a place for those who could survive, and most didn't. He urged his horse forward, his instincts kicking in. If she was out here, lost and alone, she was in trouble. She had to be. The woman's feet dragged through the sand as she took one shaky step after another. Luke could see the exhaustion in her face, the desperation in her eyes. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked like she had been walking for days without rest. She hadn't noticed him yet. "Hey!" Luke shouted, his voice rough from the dry air. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She froze for a moment, and then, as if realizing she had no choice, she stumbled toward him. She looked like she was about to collapse at any moment. Luke quickly dismounted from his horse and reached out to steady her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. She didn't speak at first, her chest rising and falling quickly, as if she couldn't catch her breath. Her eyes darted around, looking for escape. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in the endless desert, just like him. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper, strained and weak. "Just need water." He had just enough left for himself, but he couldn't leave her to die here. He handed her his canteen, the last of his precious water, and watched as she took it gratefully. "Thank you," she said, looking at him with a strange intensity. Her dark eyes, full of pain, seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. She drank slowly, savoring each drop as if it were the last she would ever taste. "Easy now," Luke said, his voice quiet. "You're going to need to save some for later." She didn't respond right away, but when she finished, she handed the canteen back to him. "You should keep it," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You gave it to me. It's yours." Luke shook his head. "You need it more than I do." He offered a small smile. "Don't worry about me. You're the one who's about to drop." She looked at him for a long moment, as if she was sizing him up. Then, without a word, she turned away and took a step toward the horizon. Luke watched her for a moment before following. "Where are you headed?" he called out. She stopped, her back to him. For a brief moment, he thought she might ignore him.
But then she spoke.
"Not far," she said, her voice steady despite the weakness in her legs. "I'm trying to make it there."
He knew the desert well.
There were few places that could offer shelter, and fewer still that held water. But the look in her eyes told him she was telling the truth. She wasn't lying. "I'll help you get there," Luke said, his voice firm. "You can't make it alone, not in this heat." She looked at him, hesitant for a moment, but then nodded. "Thank you." He didn't know what it was about, this woman that made him feel responsible for her, but something in his gut told him she wasn't just any stranger. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't leave her out here to die. They walked together, the blistering sun overhead, the dry wind making it hard to breathe. Luke's horse followed slowly behind them, moving with an almost human weariness. Every step they took, the heat pressed down harder, and the landscape seemed to stretch further and further into nothingness. They didn't speak much. The silence between them was filled with the sounds of the desert, distant birds, the rustling of the wind, the pounding of their footsteps in the sand. After what felt like hours, the woman finally spoke. "My name is Tala," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "What's yours?" "Luke," he replied, glancing at her. "Where are you from, Tala?" She didn't answer at first, and Luke wondered if he had crossed a line. He didn't want to push her, but her silence made him curious. He had the feeling that there was more to her than just a woman lost in the desert. But as he looked at her, he saw something else, something in her eyes that made him want to know more. "I'm from the Apache lands," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I had to leave. I had no choice." Luke didn't ask her to explain further. He could tell that there was something she wasn't ready to talk about, but there was no time to dwell on it. The heat was unbearable, and they needed to find shelter before nightfall. They kept walking. The sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows growing longer as the air began to cool. Tala stumbled again, and Luke quickly moved to her side to catch her before she fell. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," she said, pushing herself up. But her voice was weaker than before. But he didn't argue. Instead, he picked up the pace, trying to lead them toward the hidden oasis she had mentioned. He didn't know if they would make it, but he couldn't give up now, not when he had given her his last bit of water. The desert might have been ruthless, but Luke had made his choice. He wasn't about to leave anyone behind, not today. As the hours stretched on, Luke and Tala continued their slow march through the desert, the sun now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry land. The heat was beginning to let up, but the desert was still unforgiving, and their bodies were beginning to show signs of strain. Luke's horse, though still moving forward, was slowing down, its hooves dragging through the sand with each step. Tala, too, had begun to struggle, her movements slow and labored. "Take a break," Luke said, his voice gentle as he stopped his horse and dismounted. His eyes searched the landscape for any sign of shelter or shade, but there was nothing. The desert was empty, just sand and heat, stretching as far as the eye could see. Tala looked at him, her face a mask of exhaustion. She didn't argue, though. She sat down on a rock, the only solid surface in sight, and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "I'm fine," she said, though the words came out in a raspy whisper. Luke knew she wasn't fine. He could see it in the way she moved, in the way her eyes seemed to lose focus at times, but he didn't push her. They both needed to rest, even if just for a few moments. He pulled the horse's reins and led it into the shade of a distant rock formation. He would give them both a chance to catch their breath. As Luke sat beside her, he took a deep breath, feeling the dry air fill his lungs. It was strange, being out here in the vastness of the desert, surrounded by nothing but sand and sky. He had ridden through this place many times, but it had never felt like this. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight he couldn't shake. Tala, too, seemed lost in thought. Her eyes were distant, focused on something beyond the horizon, as if the desert itself was calling her. She seemed to have a connection to this land, a deep, unspoken understanding of its ways. Luke could feel it in the silence between them, a shared knowledge that came from surviving in a place where nothing else mattered but the land, the water, and the sky. "I've never seen anything like this," Luke said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the weariness was evident in his tone. "The desert, I mean. I've been through it before, but never like this. Never this hot. Never this dry." Tala turned her head toward him, her eyes soft but filled with a quiet strength. "The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily," she said, her voice low but steady. "It takes what it wants, and it doesn't care who you are." He had heard stories from other travelers, tales of men who had set out into the desert and never returned. Some said it was the heat that took them. Others said it was the isolation, the loneliness that crept in when you were too far from the world. Whatever it was, the desert was unforgiving. "I don't know why I feel like this," Luke said, more to himself than to her. "I've been in tough places before, but out here with you, I don't know. It feels different." Ella's gaze softened, and she studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's because the desert has a way of changing people. It strips you of everything you think you know. And when you're left with nothing, you have to rely on the land and on the people around you." Luke shifted uncomfortably at her words. There was truth in them. He could feel it in his bones. He had always prided himself on being a loner, a man who could survive without anyone's help. But out here, in the vast emptiness of the desert, it was different. He needed her, just as much as she needed him. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The desert stretched out before them, a never-ending sea of sand. Luke's horse snorted softly, its tail swishing in the dry air. Finally, Tala stood up, brushing the sand from her clothes. "We can't stay here long," she said, her voice steady again. "The oasis isn't far now, but we have to move." His legs felt stiff and his mouth was dry, but he didn't complain. They couldn't afford to waste time. He pulled his canteen from his side, glancing at it one last time. It was almost empty now, but there was still enough for one more drink, just enough to keep them going a little longer. He handed it to Tala, but she shook her head. You take it, she said. You need it more than I do. Luke frowned but didn't argue. He drank deeply from the canteen, the cool water sliding down his throat, giving him a moment of relief. When he finished, he wiped his mouth and handed the canteen back to Tala. I'm fine, he said, but his voice was more tired than he meant it to sound. Tala didn't respond immediately. She just took the canteen and took a long drink. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if savoring the small comfort the water gave her. We should go, Luke said, ready to move on. The oasis was close, and every step brought them closer to safety. He didn't know what would await them there, but he had to believe it would be better than the desert. They began walking again, their footsteps heavy in the sand. The heat had lessened, but the desert was still a place of danger. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, a struggle to survive in a land that offered no mercy. As they moved forward, Luke couldn't help but glance at Tala every so often. There was something about her, something he couldn't put into words. It wasn't just the way she moved, the way she seemed to understand the land better than anyone he had ever met. It was something deeper, a connection he couldn't explain. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was facing the world alone. Tala had become more than just a stranger in the desert. She had become someone he needed to protect. He didn't know why, but he knew he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Together, they pushed forward, the oasis just beyond the next ridge. With every step, they came closer to something better, something that would change everything. The oasis was closer now, just over the next rise. Luke and Tala had walked for what felt like hours, the weight of the desert pressing down on them. The sand beneath their boots felt like it would never end, but the oasis was real and it was waiting for them. Luke could almost taste the cool water, feel the shade of the trees that would shelter them from the harsh sun. Tala was quieter now, her steps more deliberate. She had been moving more slowly since their break, but Luke couldn't blame her. She had been through as much as he had, maybe more. He glanced at her every few moments, noticing the way her eyes darted over the desert, as if searching for something just out of reach. There was a tension in the air now, a change in the way she carried herself. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the top of a small hill. The oasis lay below them, a small pool of water surrounded by palm trees and thick green brush. The sight of it was like a miracle, and Luke felt his breath catch in his throat. He had been thirsty for so long, and now the water was within his grasp. We made it, he said softly, looking down at Tala, who was staring at the oasis with a strange look in her eyes. But instead of relief, her face was filled with something else, something Luke couldn't place. She didn't look at him. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements slow but determined. Tala? Luke asked, a knot forming in his stomach. What's wrong? She stood at the edge of the hill, her gaze fixed on the oasis below, her body stiff. The wind blew her hair back, and Luke saw a flash of something in her eyes, a memory, a fear. It was like she was seeing something beyond the oasis, something that only she could understand. Tala finally turned to him, her expression more serious than he had ever seen. There's something you don't know about me, Luke, she said quietly. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had a feeling this was coming. Something in her had changed, something that had been hidden from him, but he didn't know what. What is it? He asked, his voice low. Tala took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak. I'm not just anyone, she said slowly. I'm the daughter of the Apache chief, the one the raiders are after. Luke froze. His mind went blank for a moment. He had known there was more to her story, but this was something he had never expected. You're the chief's daughter? He repeated, almost not believing it. But why are they after you? Tala's eyes darkened, and she took a step back, turning her gaze back to the oasis. The raiders, they want something from me, she said. Something very important. They think I have it. Luke took a step closer, his pulse quickening. What do they want? Tala hesitated, her lips trembling. A map, she said quietly. A map that leads to a sacred place. A place that's hidden from the world, a place where great power lies. My father's people have protected it for generations. Luke's mind raced. He could see now why she had been so guarded. The raiders weren't just after her. They were after something much more valuable, something that could change everything. They think you have this map? Luke asked. Tala nodded. I took it from them, she said, her voice firm but laced with a trace of guilt. I couldn't let them have it. My father would never have allowed it, but the raiders, they wanted to use it for their own gain. To control the land, to control everything. I couldn't let them do that. Luke stood still for a long moment, absorbing her words. The weight of the desert, the heat, the struggle they had just endured, it all seemed small now compared to what she was telling him. He could feel the tension in the air, the danger that was now surrounding them. They weren't just two people trying to survive. They were caught in something much bigger than themselves. "I never meant to drag you into this," Tala said, her voice softer now. "But now that you're here, I can't let you go." Luke felt a surge of protectiveness rise in him. He didn't know exactly why he felt so connected to her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of something important. "You're not dragging me into anything," he said firmly. "We're in this together now. I'm not going anywhere." Tala gave him a small, grateful smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She still looked as if the weight of everything was pressing down on her, as if she were carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. They stood there for a moment, both of them staring at the oasis below, each lost in their thoughts. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise that filled the air. Finally, Tala broke the silence. "We need to get to the oasis," she said.
"It's the only place we can hide for now, but it won't be safe for long."
"The raiders will be close." Luke nodded, though his mind was still spinning with what she had told him. "Then let's go," he said. "We can rest for a while, but we need to keep moving." She began walking down the hill toward the oasis, her steps more determined now. Luke followed, his eyes never leaving her. He couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. They reached the water's edge, and Luke's heart raced with relief as he knelt by the pool, cupping his hands to drink. The water was cool and refreshing, and for the first time in days, he felt his body begin to relax. He glanced over at Tala, who was kneeling beside him. She had taken a long drink, but her eyes were still far away. Luke could see the thoughts racing in her mind, the way she seemed to be constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for something. "Are you okay?" Luke asked. Tala nodded, but there was no conviction in it. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked the strength it once had. I don't know what's going to happen next." He didn't know what would happen either. But one thing was clear. This desert, this journey had already changed them both. And whatever came next, they would face it together. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Luke and Tala sat by the water's edge, their silence speaking volumes. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. They were in this fight together, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they needed to protect the world from those who would destroy it. The night had fallen over the oasis, casting long shadows across the sand. The air was cooler now, but still heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Luke and Tala sat by the water, their backs to the shelter of the palm trees. Tala's eyes flickered from the pool to the horizon, always watching, always waiting. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. Luke knew she was right. The raiders were still out there, and they were getting closer. The map she carried, the one that could lead to the sacred site of great power, was the key to everything. The raiders wouldn't stop until they had it, no matter the cost. And now Luke had found himself in the middle of a battle that was much bigger than him, bigger than either of them. "I don't like this," Luke said, his voice low. "We should have moved sooner." Tala turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We had to rest," she said. "We needed to gather strength for what's coming." Luke nodded. He knew she was right. They had both been through so much already, and pushing on without rest would have only weakened them. But still, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. The oasis might have been a place of safety for a short time, but it wouldn't hold up against the raiders forever. Not if they kept coming. "We don't have much time," Luke said, standing up and stretching. "We need to figure out our next move." Tala followed his lead, standing and scanning the horizon once more. "The raiders will be here by morning," she said. "We can't outrun them. We have to face them." Luke turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, face them? We don't have enough strength for a fight." "I know," Tala said, her voice steady. "But we have the map. We have to use it. It's our only chance." Luke looked at her, trying to understand. "How can the map help us?" "I thought it was supposed to lead to some hidden place. How does that help us now?" Tala gave him a small, almost sad smile. "The map leads to more than just a place. It leads to a power. Something my people have protected for generations. If we can reach it before the raiders, we can stop them. They won't be able to use the power for their own gain." It wasn't just a map. It was a key to something bigger, something with the potential to change everything. But could they get to it before the raiders did? And what would they find when they got there? "Then we need to move fast," Luke said, his voice filled with resolve. "We don't have time to waste. We get to that place before they do, and we make sure they never find it." Tala nodded. She seemed to be more certain now, the weight of the desert and the danger no longer keeping her back. She had a purpose, and Luke could see it in her eyes. She was ready to face whatever came next. "We leave at first light," she said. "We need to be quiet, move swiftly, and stay hidden. If the raiders see us, they'll track us until the end of the earth." Luke didn't argue. He had always been good at hiding when he needed to, and he was ready to do whatever it took to keep them both alive. They were a team now, and no matter how dangerous the road ahead was, he wouldn't let anything happen to Tala. As the night stretched on, the two of them sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The crackling of the fire was the only sound between them, the warmth of the flames a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the desert. "I'm glad I met you, Luke," Tala said after a long pause. Her voice was quiet but sincere. Luke looked over at her, surprised by the words. "I'm glad I met you too, Tala," he said. "I don't know where this journey is taking us, but I know I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. You're a good man, Luke. I'm not used to depending on others, but I can see that you're different." Luke couldn't help but feel a connection to her, something deeper than just a shared struggle. She wasn't just the daughter of a chief or a woman running from raiders. She was someone he could trust, someone who had become a part of his world in ways he couldn't explain. "You've got a lot of strength in you," Luke said, his voice low. "I can see it." Tala's eyes met his, and for a moment there was nothing but the silent understanding between them. They had both been through so much, and yet here they were, still standing. They were survivors. "We'll make it," Tala said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "We have to." The next morning they rose before the sun, ready to begin their journey to the hidden site. The air was cooler at dawn, and the desert, though still vast and empty, seemed less oppressive in the soft light of the early morning. They gathered their things quickly, making sure to leave no trace of their presence behind. Luke mounted his horse, and Tala, with her long legs, moved with a grace that belied her exhaustion. She seemed more focused now, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and Luke followed her lead. The map was in her possession, hidden safely in her pack. It was their only hope. The oasis, now behind them, seemed like a distant memory. They had no time to linger. Their path took them north, toward the mountains in the distance. Tala had studied the map well, and she knew where they were headed, but Luke had no idea what awaited them at the end of the journey. They didn't speak much as they rode. The journey was long, and every step felt like it could be their last. The threat of the raiders was never far from their minds, but they pushed forward, knowing that they couldn't stop until they reached their goal. After several days of travel, they arrived at a narrow canyon. The rocks on either side were steep and jagged, casting deep shadows over the path. The air was cooler here, but there was something about the place that felt ancient, as if the land itself held secrets. "This is it," Tala said, her voice filled with awe. "We're close." Luke's heart pounded in his chest as they rode deeper into the canyon. The map had led them here, but he had no idea what to expect. All he knew was that this place was important, and if they reached it before the raiders, they might just have a chance to stop them. Suddenly, a shout echoed through the canyon. Luke's heart skipped a beat. The raiders had found them. "Get ready," he shouted, his hand going to his gun. They weren't going down without a fight. Tala's face hardened. "We won't let them take it," she said, determination filling her voice. As the raiders emerged from the shadows, Luke and Tala prepared for the final stand. They had come this far, and now there was no turning back.